So just like to welcome you to this symposium on the problem and the solution for nicotine addiction. And we are really grateful to have with us today Andrew da Roza, who has been really putting in a lot of time, effort into studying issues. And one of the issues in which he has done a lot of work in to look at actually what are the ways to help people to quit, what is the actual state of the situation, has been tobacco addiction or smoking. So without any further delays, I'm going to let Andrew get on with this presentation. Over to you.
Thanks. All right, so now what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about the smoking prevalence rates in Singapore. We're going to talk about why cigarettes are so addictive. We're going to talk about the current solutions that are being used here in Singapore. And we're also going to talk about the current solutions as being a problem. Then we're going to talk about alternative solutions. And this is where a lot of discussion, I hope, will be engendered and people will send in their questions. So the possibilities are more empower measures, and I'll explain what those are later, that we have better nicotine replacement therapy, better methods of delivering nicotine through nicotine replacement therapy, more information from the government, narrowing our Singapore wealth gap, which is very wide, the widest in Asia, and also the new nicotine delivery technologies. And I'm sure there's lots of questions about e-cigarettes and also about products which are called heat not burn products, which have special tobacco inserted in the devices. Please tell Daniel to mute his mic. Okay. Now, smoking prevalence rates. Let's start with smoking prevalence rates. The rate that's published by the Singapore government is 12% prevalence. So that's the national prevalence rate of smoking. Now, I would urge everyone on the call to hightail it to this link here, which is the World Health Organization report on the tobacco epidemic, and it's the Singapore country profile. Now, this site has information that's not published by the government and is not talked about in the media, but is the information that's provided by the Singapore government. And it shows a somewhat different picture. Now, here's what the government's number of 12%, here's where it comes from. So daily smoking for males is 21.1%. So about a fifth of men in Singapore smoke. The daily smoking for females is quite low, 3.4%. And then that gives you the total population daily smoking rate of 12%. So that's the national number that you see quite often. Now, the WHO does actually publish the age and trend standardization rates for Singapore, meaning that they run the numbers through a calculation, a formula, that evens out the age so that it's the same as other countries. So we can compare like for like. We compare like prevalence rates for like prevalence rates in other countries. And also for trend. So they go back to 1990 and they standardize for trend. And there you get a quite different picture, because you'll see that the current smoking rates for males is 27.9, so 28%, and current smoking for females is 5.2, so much higher than the previous rate you saw there for daily smoking. So the total prevalence for Singapore is 16.5%. So that's the World Health Organization number. And our population at the moment, give or take, is about 5.85 million people. So the total number of smokers in Singapore is about 1 million. So we have 1 million smokers in Singapore. And these are current smoking. So unlike daily smoking, this includes the numbers of people who don't smoke every day. Okay, so about 1 million people. Now this number is still an underestimation because it doesn't have those people who are exposed to side stream smoke and exhaled smoke, and it doesn't have people who are exposed to the toxins that smokers leave on couches and armchairs and things like that. So that's the third hand smoking. So if we just assume that one person for every smoker is exposed daily to smoking side stream smoke and exhaled smoke and toxins on furniture and stuff, then we probably have a total figure of about 2 million people. So about 2 million people are exposed to the hazards of smoking in Singapore. And our population is about 5.85 million. Now, there's more bad news, I'm afraid. This is very depressing to hear, I know. I mentioned earlier that the government figure of 12% excludes the non-daily smokers, and the WHO estimate that to be about 3%. So 3% of the population are non-daily smokers. It also excludes, this 12% also excludes non-Singapore citizens. So we have about 1.2 million of them, which is about 20% of our population. So that 12% doesn't cover those non-Singapore citizens. A lot of those citizens are people who are highly vulnerable to smoking, such as our very large group of guest workers who live here. It also excludes youth, and the government haven't given us a youth figure. Unfortunately, the figure that has been given to the WHO by the government is 13 years old to 20 years old. So that disguises an awful lot. We don't know what the smoking prevalence is from the age of about 10 years old to about the age of 17 before they go into the army. So we don't have a good figure. The government used to publish the secondary school figures for smoking. They stopped that in 2012. It's no longer available on the websites. But back then it was roughly about 5% to 6%. So something like that for kids smoking. Now, the other thing about this 12% is that it's the result of a methodology change in the last population health survey in 2016, 2017. That was the most recent health survey. And we don't know how the methodology was changed and how it affected the figures. Now, it also disguises the prevalence rates and increases in prevalence rates among segments of the population. So, for example, prevalence among females has increased 22% in the last 20 years, and that compares to a 30% decrease in males smoking. So you can see that the increase in female smoking is extremely worrying. Then there's a prevalence amongst youth, is not disclosed, but we do know that it was about 33% increase between 2004 and 2010. But these are old figures. We don't have recent figures, and some of these have been removed from the websites if you try and Google the things. So overall, prevalence has remained unchanged since about 2001, 2002. It says 2004 there, but it goes back further. And that's probably the most worrying thing, that the prevalence rate really hasn't shifted very much. And here are the figures, and you'll see it's roughly been about 13%, give or take, since 2001. And this is an outlier here. Again, we're not sure how the methodology changed all this, since the same methodology was used in the previous years. All right, so we see that the government target is 10% this year, and we don't necessarily expect that to happen, but a new public health survey will be published. The trouble with the public health surveys is that they've now been removed from the internet, so that the only one available is the most recent, and the most recent is a summary. So the government has reduced it to a couple of paragraphs, which used to be quite a long public health survey of smoking results. And it was very useful because it talked about prevalence rates and so forth. But you can't find that anymore. It's just now a very short executive summary, and that includes an executive summary on diabetes and so on. Now, what have we actually done here in Singapore? And actually, we've done a great deal. The government has really done a great deal to try and address this smoking problem. Now, Singapore signed what's called the WHO, the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So we signed that. We were one of the earliest adopters here in Asia. We adopted it with fervor, way ahead of other countries in Asia, I would add. And if I contrast us to the United States, it's kind of sad. The United States are not even a party to this, and they certainly haven't adopted these measures that are recommended by the WHO. Now, those recommendations are called MPOWER for short, and that's a list of those measures there. They try and control tobacco advertising, sales, and so on and so forth. And they talk about raising taxes so that there's a sin tax on tobacco. So those are the measures there. It's an acronym, MPOWER, and you see them listed there. We can go back to that later if you wish. Now, we we signatories of this Framework Tobacco Convention have to submit data every year, and the data is nicely color-coded to show how much we have complied with those MPOWER recommendations. And the color coding is that if you're a dark blue, that's great. You've implemented everything that's recommended by the WHO. If you're a light blue, that's bad. That means you haven't implemented everything the WHO recommends. And if you're red, that's really bad. And so you'll see that we have one light blue there, smoke-free policies, and we've got a rather sad no red there on taxes. Essentially, our taxes have not kept pace with increased incomes. So cigarettes are more affordable now than they used to be. That's what that means. In terms of the smoke-free policies, we have smoking rooms. That means places available for people to smoke. And the WHO don't recommend that. So that's why we are light blue there. Now, if we look at other countries that have implemented the MPOWER measures completely, there are only a few. There's a handful. One of the biggest ones is Brazil. And Brazil, you'll see there, has these nice dark blue squares. So they've implemented everything possible. And they got well over $1 billion from Bloomberg. Bloomberg is a great anti-smoking trust lobbyist. And they produced a lot of money for Brazil to implement these measures. And so they're all dark blue. So you may imagine if they've implemented all the measures, they must have low smoking rates, and the MPOWER measures are therefore rather good, or at least enough. However, unfortunately, the current smoking prevalence rate in Brazil is about 12.2%. So not too far from Singapore's 16%, but, or if you use the government's figures, not the WHO's figures, our smoking prevalence rate, current smoking prevalence rate, remember that's daily and non-daily, is about 14.5. So compared to Brazil, we've still got a couple of percent to go. But in any case, unfortunately, we won't get down to the 10%. It will be stuck roughly around the 13% we've had since 2001. That's what this suggests, if you look at Brazil. Okay, so we're going to be stagnant if we continue with MPOWER. Even if we increased the level of MPOWER measures to the level of Brazil, we're going to be stuck. That's my hypothesis. Now, why are cigarettes so addictive? And you can imagine why they are addictive. I just thought I'd draw your attention to the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which has smoking in it. And smoking is an addiction. It's a tobacco use disorder. So it's like alcohol use disorder or substance use disorder. It's categorized in the same way. And the characteristics of how you diagnose that disorder are very, very similar to all the other drugs and alcohol. So you can see the list there, and they won't be of any surprise to anyone in the audience. Now, cigarettes are incredibly dangerous and addictive. And there's one study that I urge everyone to have a look at. It's Dr. Nutt's study. Dr. Nutt is a UK doctor. He has done a landmark study, and he repeated the study, giving roughly the same results. But his landmark study was in The Lancet in 2010. It ranged all these drugs of abuse, alcohol and tobacco, in order. And they were in order of most addictive and most dangerous. And each expert who gave a score to these substances, so things like heroin and so on, they actually gave these scores and added up the scores for each of these different substances. So tobacco, burning tobacco, came out with a score of 26. And 26 is very, very high. And if I didn't show you the graph here, I just wanted to save the slides, but you'd see that it's the 6th most harmful substance out of that range of 25 or 26 substances. It's slightly less harmful than methamphetamine, which had a score of 33, and cocaine, which had a score of 27, so it's pretty close to cocaine, and more harmful than amphetamine or cannabis, which had a score of 23 and 20. So pretty harmful stuff. There's lots of studies trying to compare the addictive nature of smoking to other substances, and they come up quite consistently with being more addictive or as addictive as heroin. And they look at different ways of measuring that, which we can talk about later if you wish. And proportionately more people are addicted to smoking than any other addictive substance. So if you look at all those substances, including alcohol, this is the most addictive one. 70% of smokers want to quit, 95% have tried and failed, and we think that maybe, sorry, I'm just trying to move my box here so I can, Mooney's head is in the way of my box. Here we go. Sorry. It may take 30 or more quit attempts. So studies have shown that it takes about 30, roughly between 25 and 30 quit attempts for most people who are trying to quit to actually quit. So smokers and to give you an idea of how addictive it is, smokers who've had one of their lungs removed or have had severe heart attacks, about 40 to 70% return to smoking. And then cancer smokers, about 35 to 50%, depending on the study, continue to smoke. Now, there are a lot of toes and legs and feet and fingers amputated because of smoking, because it essentially stops blood flow. But a large proportion of them return to smoking and they just lose their toes one at a time. So they cannot give up, is my hypothesis. Smokers cannot give up with prevention and cessation controls alone. So with Empower measures alone, it doesn't seem to be possible for smokers to give up in large numbers. As you may remember, we have about 1 million smokers here in Singapore. Now, what causes the addiction? As you can imagine, there's a high reward and reinforcement, but there is no intoxicating effect. So unlike heroin or alcohol, people can still continue doing their jobs, still continue conversations and so on. And in fact, it improves their cognitive abilities and their coordination. So unlike other drugs of abuse, you don't get the intoxicating effect that's debilitating. There's a speed and quantity that's delivered to the brain by smoking that is extremely fast. Even if you try and inject nicotine, you won't get it in the brain and the sites of action faster than smoking it. And I can explain that later if you're interested, why that's the case. There are changes in the brain, like all drugs of abuse and alcohol. There's an upregulation in this case of these receptors that receive the nicotinic receptors. They upregulate, and then overnight they resensitize. So there's this cycle that goes on with nicotine that makes them very addictive. Their genes seem to have a part to play in whether someone becomes addicted to nicotine and to smoking. They're about 28 to 84% of the reasons why someone might be smoking may be related to genes. There's people with mental illnesses, anxiety, depression, and so on, are much more vulnerable to smoking. They use that to manage their symptoms of their illness and also the symptoms of the medication they take for their illness. There's peer acceptance and peer pressure, as you know, impulsiveness and so on, excitement, rebellion amongst teens, the seeking identity and so forth. There's family modeling, availability, which is very important here in Singapore. They are very available. They're available in many, many, many hundreds of places. And so knowledge about how to use a cigarette is clearly quite widespread, and they're very affordable. I mentioned the Empower measures where we had a red box. Here in Singapore, we have not raised taxes to meet incomes that have risen, so they're more affordable now than they've ever been. Now, poverty is a big thing here in Singapore. I'll talk about that later. The gap is very, very wide here. The Gini coefficient gap, as it's called, is very wide here. And we know that poverty is one of the biggest factors in being vulnerable to smoking. Cycle of tolerance, habits, and withdrawal, very much like all the other substances and alcohol, there is this habit and withdrawal effect, as well as this tolerance effect. Tolerance is that you need to do more and more of it to get the same effect. And withdrawal is you feel pretty bad if you don't have that substance in your bloodstream going to your brain. And so smokers will experience tolerance. They'll smoke more and more up to a point. So from perhaps 1 cig or 2 cigarettes a week to 10 cigarettes to 20 cigarettes and so forth. And then there's a sense of withdrawal. So whatever good effects that someone had from smoking, they will feel the exact opposite when they're not smoking after a period of time, which is about 35 to 40 minutes, nicotine starts to dissipate enough for someone to get a withdrawal effect. So it happens pretty quickly with nicotine. Nicotine is the half-life is about 2 hours, so it happens pretty quickly. The cycle of tolerance, habits, and withdrawal. So I mentioned that illness from smoking takes 20 to 40 years to show. So early morbidity and early mortality is a long-term process. So people who want instant gratification are not really persuaded that they're going to get sick in 20 to 40 years, particularly if you're 20 years old. So those are some of the reasons why. Now, I mentioned the psychoactive effects of nicotine, which is rather unusual. It's different from other drugs. There are two substances in burning tobacco smoke that cause this psychoactive effect. One is nicotine, the other is monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Now, it sounds like a mouthful. It is a mouthful. These are chemicals that inhibit an enzyme that sits in the brain and changes the chemical composition of catecholamines like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. So those drugs, those neurotransmitters are generally broken down by this enzyme. And that's why it doesn't stay in the synapse between the two neurons. I can go into more detail later when you ask questions. But the point is that what smoking does is it neutralizes this enzyme. So you have dopamine and you have serotonin and you have norepinephrine just in that gap for longer periods, triggering the neurons more. Now, just like other drugs of abuse and even behavioral addictions like gambling, it produces dopamine in an area of the brain called VTA, which goes to the nucleus accumbens, and so you get this reward effect. Now, here's the unusual thing about nicotine and these monoamine oxidase inhibitors. It is if you like, a panacea. If you are stressed or if you are anxious, it will relieve stress and anxiety. If you're depressed, if you have a low mood, it will lift your mood. If you need some motivation, some enthusiasm to get going, it'll do that too. It'll help you with that. It increases cognitive performance, short-term memory, and it even helps you with imagination. You can have reveries when you take in these substances, and that helps you if you're thinking about stuff. It also reduces the symptoms of mental disorders and the medication side effects, which is why I mentioned smoking is so prevalent amongst people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and so on. So nicotine has some great effects, and that's why it's used so widely, and that's why it's so addictive. Now, what are the solutions? So we have some conventional solutions here. The first group of solutions are medication, and you'll know about nicotine replacement therapies, patches, gums, lozenges, and so on. There are other nicotine replacement therapies that are more effective than patches, gums, and lozenges that are not available here in Singapore. It's not that they're illegal, it's just they're not sold here. And it's, I'm told by the pharmacists that it's because they're not popular. But mouth sprays, inhalers, and nasal sprays are much more effective because they deliver more nicotine faster to the sites of action in the brain than patches, gums, and lozenges. But they're not available here. Varenicline is the only drug in our addiction universe that was specifically made for an addiction, which in this case is smoking. So it's tailor-made for smoking. It sits on a very, very specific part of the nicotine, acetylcholine nicotine, the nicotine receptor. I'll briefly say that it's just this receptor. It's a very small part of this receptor that it sits on, so it's very specific, and it reduces the stimulation you get from nicotine, reduces cravings and urges, and reduces, we believe, the withdrawal effects. So that helps with smoking cessation. And then bupropion is the other one that's available here in Singapore. It's a different drug with a different method of action, a different way of attacking this, but it has similar effects in that it reduces cravings and withdrawals. And you'll see on the screen that there are some others as well, and we can talk about those if you like later on. So there are some drugs. Now, how effective are they? So I started here with nicotine replacement therapy. Are they effective? I've used cold turkey as the comparator. So that means Tahan therapy. You don't use anything else, you just try and stop on your own. And you'll see from these drugs, there's lots of numbers up here, but you'll see from these drugs that gum is about 66% more likely to help someone quit than cold turkey. And then you'll see patches are 76% more likely to help people. And then spray, as you can see, is much more effective, twice as effective as just struggling on your own, and so on. So they do work, but they don't work very much. I mean, because of two things, but we'll talk about that later. Now, varenicline is about 3 times more effective than just cold turkey. You'll see some studies that talk about 4 times more effective, so different studies with different numbers. Bupropion is about twice more effective than just Tahan therapy. In some studies, it's 3 times more effective, but roughly the same, as you'll see from back here, roughly the same as inhalers and sublingual tablets. Now, you can combine all this stuff, and there are lots of studies that show that combining all these things actually works better than just those single things alone. So you combine nicotine replacement therapy and bupropion and varenicline. You can even combine, I saw a study combining varenicline with bupropion. It seems to be better than just either of those substances on their own because they have different mechanisms of action, as I explained. So the combinations of these things, much better. And most people, most pharmacists may or may not tell you that a patch is not sufficient. You should have gum as well, because patches just give a very steady dose of nicotine to the brain, but it's not enough to address cravings and urges. So a combination of patch and gum, patch and lozenge is very common. But anyway, combining all these things, better outcomes. Now, so I've already said that. So it increases, combining all these things increases the chances of smoking cessation for the long term. All right, now, the problem with nicotine replacement therapy, massive problem is no one uses it who's a smoker, bar a very few. So you're talking about roughly 2% to 6% of most smokers who want to quit, this is globally, will have a go at these nicotine replacement therapies. They're just not attractive to smokers. Partly it's because there's not enough nicotine going to the brain, to the site of action in the brain. There are obviously no sensations of the smoking, like the smoke that you get in your lungs and the feel and touch of the cigarette, all those sensations. There's no rituals behind it. You know, you just pop a piece of gum in, and there's no social benefits, unlike smoking. They're very unattractively marketed, and you basically have to own up as being a sick person, which smokers don't, by the way. You have to own up as a sick person to trundle along to a pharmacy and buy these things. And they're quite expensive. So if you combine these things, they're much more expensive than smoking. And that's a question of whether we subsidize these things. But at the moment, it's more expensive than smoking. So that's prohibitive to smokers. And of course, for some people, nicotine replacement therapy is associated with repression and shame and so on. That's with some smokers. Now, varenicline is great, as I showed you earlier. It's 3 times or 4 times better than just trying to give up on your own, but it has side effects. My clients, almost all my clients, have nausea and these very weird dreams, very intense dreams, sometimes nightmares. It says here 40% and 30%. Those are the figures from studies, but my own clinical experiences, it's pretty inevitable. There's agitation and aggression and depression, particularly depression, I find in some of my clients, but it's hard to differentiate that from their addiction or the other things that are going on in their lives. There's suicide ideation, which is very worrying in the studies, and seizures, which is rare, but also worrying, and worsening of psychiatric symptoms, which seems to be more common than the studies suggest when you look at it clinically. Okay, so side effects for varenicline, not terribly attractive. Bupropion, same thing, has side effects. There's a very tiny group of people who get seizures. Lower libido is the one that my clients complain about quite a bit, and insomnia. Those are the 2 things that clients complain about quite a bit. Headaches, dizziness, skin rashes, and so on. These things are rarer, but dry mouth is a little more common. Cardiovascular events is rare, but still happens. And of course, there's drug interaction that you have to be really wary of if you're prescribing these things. Okay, so the most important problem with varenicline and bupropion is non-compliance, and that's something that we all face as medical practitioners. Compliance to medication is extremely low in the population. Even medication that is vital to someone's life, they tend to forget to take it. So compliance is the biggest problem. So that's why varenicline and bupropion are probably the less effective than the clinical studies would suggest, because in clinical studies you pay people to continue to take them. So not necessarily the answer in the population, the smoking population. Now, we come to therapy. I want to give plenty of time for questions, so I'll breeze through this. So smoking addiction, tobacco use disorder is very similar to any other addiction, and all the other kinds of interventions that are commonly used for addictions can be used here. The ones that have been well studied, got good empirical evidence, are motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapies, any kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. They all seem to be roughly the same in terms of outcomes, whether it's the standard cognitive therapy, the cognitive behavioral therapy, the acceptance and commitment therapy, or the dialectical behavioral therapy, and so on and so forth. These are all have roughly the same outcomes. You can use the relapse prevention plan, just like you would with any other addictions. I've given you a link there to the standard text on this. There are other relapse prevention plan workbooks, so this one is kind of the tried and tested text that's been used for many, many years in the addictions field. And there's 12-step program. So similar to Alcoholics Anonymous, there's something called Nicotine Anonymous. They follow the 12-step program. They have a great site. I've given that to you. They're a group of people who are not therapists. They're not practitioners. They're just some people trying to stop smoking, and they help each other. And it's there's a lot of camaraderie. They hold meetings online, and they go through the 12-step process. You can get a sponsor to take you through the 12 steps and so on. It's a very effective organization, mostly funded out of the US, but is a global organization. Then there's contingency management, which is a fancy way of saying giving someone a reward for not smoking. This is quite effective in the addictions field. Contingency management, one of the most effective methods of getting people off any kind of substance or behavioral addiction. And the government is running a contingency management program, the Quit Smoke program. You can go along to a pharmacy, it's all on the websites, and you can have your cotinine levels, or maybe it's the CO2 levels. No, I think it's cotinine levels. Yeah, cotinine levels, which is a byproduct of breaking down nicotine. Cotinine levels measured at the pharmacy. There's a whole list of pharmacies, and then you can keep going back there and get rewards vouchers for those pharmacies every time you come back with a nice clean record. So the government has this contingency management program. I'm not sure how effective it is. The Health Promotion Board tells me it's not because people are not taking it up. But we don't have any numbers. The government hasn't published any numbers on that. Mindfulness and meditation, perhaps one of the most important interventions for all addictions, including smoking. We can talk about that later if you have questions on that. And now, what is the effect of therapy? So we do have some numbers. I've only given you a few here. These are the official numbers from the Health Promotion Board. I thought I might as well give you the official numbers. Brief advice alone. So we're comparing it to, once again, cold turkey. So cold turkey, roughly speaking, in the population of people who are giving up or trying to give up, is about 1.5% succeed long term. So 1.5% of people who try to give up succeed in the long term in any 1 year. So that's what that number means. So we're comparing it against cold turkey. So brief advice alone is about 2%, not a lot of difference. Therapy alone is about 7%, which is really good. It's pretty high. Therapy plus nicotine replacement bupropion is very high, 13 to 19%. So that's compared to 1.5, so that's pretty good. NRT alone, nicotine replacement therapy alone, is about 8%, and bupropion alone is about 9%. So much better results with therapy. Therapy plus patch, so it's about twice as effective. As I say, patch is probably the least effective, or is the least effective nicotine replacement therapy. All right. Now, what are we going to do about this problem? We've got 1 million people who smoke. We've got very low percentage of people who will take nicotine replacement therapy, very low indeed. We've got varenicline and bupropion, all of which have side effects, and medication compliance is low. And we have nicotine replacement therapy as being something that does have some effect, but is not a lot better, perhaps twice as better, or twice better than just going it alone. So we could, of course, have more empower measures, in particular higher sin taxes. That seems to be the one where we had the red box. We could have smoking bans and smoking room bans that would get that light blue box into a dark blue box. We can restrict the number of retail outlets. We can, because at the moment it's prevalent throughout Singapore, there's hundreds and hundreds of retail outlets, ways of buying cigarettes. We could subsidize medication, which is what I would suggest, perhaps make it free, make all nicotine replacement therapy free, make varenicline and bupropion at a low level, so subsidized by the government, and make nicotine replacement therapy available as widely as cigarettes are. So every person who sells a cigarette must also sell nicotine replacement therapy. We could do that. These empower measures, though, as I showed you with Brazil, will have some effect, but will not bring us down to those 10% levels that the government are hoping for. Now, we could have better marketing for nicotine replacement therapy designs and so on, make them look cooler, and we can have their nicotine delivery improved. As I mentioned, the mouth sprays and nasal inhalers and all these sorts of things, they're much more effective. We could have more information on smoking from the government. We really do need those health reports in detail. Those summaries aren't good enough. We need to know the prevalence rates better, as I explained earlier at the front end. We need to have the quit rates. We need to know what NRT and medication is doing for our population. Is it efficacious? Is it effective? We need to cohort the segmentation, young people, females, and so on. And we need to know specifically how these empower measures are going, because we don't know that. So continue to narrow the wealth gap is the most important thing. We are one of the highest in Asia and one of the highest worldwide. Our gap is one of the widest worldwide. We need more research on e-cigarettes and heat-not-burn products, and perhaps we can chat about that, the safety and efficacy of those products, because they deliver nicotine to the brain faster than these other products, nicotine replacement products. They also substitute for all those sensations, for the social aspects, and many other things that you could substitute for cigarettes. So these are products that we can discuss more about later. We do need to respect smokers' rights. We do need to have them included in this conversation. We need their voice. We need to understand what would work for them. They have been excluded from the conversation, and they should not be. So we do need to a soul search about harm reduction and about the use of nicotine, the lifetime use of nicotine. And that really goes back to this issue of e-cigarettes and heat-not-burn products. So I think, so that's it. And I would really welcome all questions, particularly controversial ones. So the floor is now open.
Thank you very much, Andrew. There are questions coming in, and perhaps we just talk through the first one. One of them asked whether you were able to give any of the measures which would be more suitable for teenagers or young adults, especially even though the government says that it's banned in cigarette, we do know that a certain portion, and 4% or more of our young people do smoke.
Yes.
Would there be, what would you think would be some of the therapies or interventions which would be useful for our young people?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question, because it goes right to the soul searching question. Do we as a society prevent people from using nicotine for the rest of their lives? And do we prevent children from using nicotine? And what's the effect of nicotine on children's brains? And there's lots of research that's been done. None of it's conclusive. So it's very hard to say whether nicotine does affect children's brains. So that the studies in mouse and so on and so forth really don't conclude anything. And in order to say that nicotine affects people's brains as children and young adults, we'd have to say that a lot of our population is somehow deficient because there are a lot of smokers in our population. They mostly started when they were kids. That's the general population, mostly started when they were kids. So you'd have to say, well, the big group, there's a huge percentage of the population who have cognitive dysfunction, and that's not true. I mean, it's patently not true. So it's hard to say that smoking affects the brain. But if you say that if one says, okay, smoking affects the brain, or nicotine affects the brain, should we therefore be giving kids nicotine replacement therapy? And that goes to the harm reduction part. And so my own personal view, just my personal view, is that yes, kids have a right to life and health. They have as much a right to life and health as an adult. And they should be given all the possibilities arranged in front of them to stop smoking. That includes all the nicotine replacement therapies, and it also includes, to my mind, it also includes e-cigarettes and heat-not-burn products. Heat-not-burn products don't seem to be very accepted by people who don't smoke. That's why heat-not-burn products are probably safer in the population. The e-cigarettes have attracted people who don't smoke, although it's a very small number, they still do, and most of that small number are in the youth. They'll try it out and like the flavors and so on, but that's a small number, still a small number. So to my mind, heat-not-burn products seem to be the most viable because they don't attract non-smokers, they just attract smokers, it seems. And that's the research in the United States that was given to the FDA. So yes.
Are there any examples
the
in Asian countries?
Sorry, second?
Are there any examples in Asian countries which have managed to reduce smoking rates by using either nicotine replacement or heat-not-burn products?
Yeah. Yeah, and the statistics are amazing. Heat-not-burn products, which proliferate in Japan and South Korea, brought down the smoking rates hugely. I mean, and you can go on the websites of Korean tobacco and Japan tobacco, and you'll see the fall in the sales of their cigarettes has just plummeted. I mean, double figure percentages since heat-not-burn entered the marketplaces. So they've had enormous success with smokers not giving up smoking for heat-not-burn products. E-cigarettes, yeah, there's been some good studies done in the UK, Canada, and New Zealand around this. There haven't been studies in China, but just evidence seems to suggest that it's worked quite well in China, which has a very, very high smoking rate. So e-cigarettes have been very effective. There was a study done, randomized control done, that said that e-cigarettes were twice as effective as nicotine replacement therapy. But of course, those randomized controls trials, although they're great, don't show how accepted e-cigarettes are. And they are much more accepted than nicotine replacement therapy.
Okay. There was another question about whether NRT and varenicline are appropriate for those who use vapes. But here the question was even more interesting because it said, is it appropriate for those who use non-nicotine vapes? And my own gut feeling would be that nicotine replacement therapy for non-nicotine vapes doesn't work. But
no, I mean, yeah, I mean, nicotine is a highly addictive product. So if you're a vapor and you're not using nicotine and you're doing it for the flavor and the smoke, or not the smoke, sorry, the vapor and the sensations and all that. So if you start using nicotine, you may get addicted to nicotine, and then you'll be vaping with nicotine in it. So I'm not so sure it'll be helpful.
Yes. Now, I just want to go back to a question, because a lot of it you were doing earlier on was comparing the various therapies to actually CT or cold turkey. Do we know the actual rates for cold turkey if you don't use any therapy and you just decide that you're going to stop on your own?
Yeah.
What are the general rates in society at the moment?
Yeah, so the Health Promotion Board has 1.5% of smokers in a year who are trying to give up. And there's roughly between 50 to 70% of people each year who are trying to give up, depending on the location. We don't have good figures in Singapore. But about 1% roughly of smokers who are trying to give up manage to give up, which is a very small number.
Okay, so that's my understanding too. It's only about 1%, and so the ideal would be if we had centers which allowed. I understand that in Japan, for example, and quite a few other developed countries, they actually pay and assist citizens in their attempts to quit
Yes.
by providing subsidies or free medications.
Yeah. Yeah, so in the UK, for example, e-cigarettes are highly recommended, and the government have a program to help people who are smokers to use e-cigarettes. And so in institutions, mental institutions, hospitals, e-cigarettes are highly recommended. And I mentioned that a large proportion of people who have their lung removed and who have cardio event or cardiac events and so on and so forth go back to smoking. So this is a big, big problem. And so we see the UK sees it as a teachable moment. If they come into hospital with some sort of pulmonary disease and they're smokers, then they teach them to use e-cigarettes and they give them e-cigarettes to use. And this seems to me very, very, very important for us to do.
There's a question here that said that, sorry, I may have missed the explanation, but why are e-cigarettes and heat not burn better than cigarettes? And yeah, well, let's answer that first and then we go to the next part.
Okay. So the answer is the constituents. So in a cigarette, in a standard cigarette, you've got harmful and potentially harmful substances and compounds, and so there are about 4,600 or so of those in a burning cigarette. So you've got a lot of harmful stuff in a burning cigarette. In a heat not burn product, you've got quite a lot less. It's about 500 compounds and so forth. And the second part is the dosage. So of those dangerous products in a heat not burn product or an e-cigarette, of those substances, there are much fewer quantities. Okay, the quantities are much lower. The dosage is much lower. And so the information we have at the moment is that e-cigarettes are roughly 95% or more less harmful than a cigarette, and heat not burn products are about 90% or more less harmful. The only thing we don't know, now we know a lot about what's in cigarette smoke versus the vapors that come out of heat not burn products and that come out of e-cigarettes. So we know what's in there. And we also know what dosages. But there are a proliferation of different liquids around the world, as well as devices, of e-cigarettes. So it's much harder to know precisely the dosage and precisely what's in the vapor. But in any case, they're much safer. The other thing we don't know, so unlike heat not burn, so heat not burn is manufactured by big companies, and so we know what's in each of those big companies' products. So that's easier to know what's in there. The other thing we don't know is that over 30 years, 40 years, what would vapor do to the human body? We just don't know that because they haven't been around that long and studies haven't started. Well, some studies have started, but they're short-term studies. They're a year or so. So we can only guess what will happen after 30, 40 years. But we do know enough that suggests they are so much less harmful. And just to give you an idea, when patches first came out and gums and so on first came out, nicotine replacement therapy first came out in the 70s, 80s, there was a big controversy as to whether they contained things that were dangerous, because they do. For example, the gum I'm chewing and the patch you guys might be wearing, they contain tobacco-specific nitrosamines, okay, which is in large enough quantities harmful. So NRT does have potentially harmful and harmful substances in them. But when you look at it with, if you range them all up in ranges of risk, say NRT is there and e-cigarettes are slightly higher and heat not burn is slightly higher, before you get to a cigarette, there is a massive leap, huge leap. I don't have, I didn't put up another slide on that, but I could have done. And it's remarkable how much more dangerous a cigarette is compared to these other products.
Just for the purpose of, there's been a lot of negative publicity concerning e-cigarettes. especially the reports coming out from certain centers in America about people dying or having respiratory failure because of e-cigarettes. Would you be able to just mention, or do you know anything about that? Because I would think people
Sure,
would be interested.
sure. Yeah, it's really, really tragic. Well, what happened is that people who use a vaporizer to take in marijuana, those people were buying their liquids from these bucket shops, these small companies that were selling them on the internet, and they were adulterated. So the marijuana users were getting this adulterated product, and the way they adulterated is they put in this vitamin E product, acetate, and it makes the liquid more viscous, right? And in the old days, the way a marijuana user could tell whether the liquid was high potency or not was to see how thick it was. And so they turn the thing upside down to see whether it slides down the glass longer. And so what these guys did was they adulterated it to make it more, to make this liquid for marijuana users more viscous. And that caused this terrible problem. It was never a problem for e-cigarette users. Obviously, e-cigarette users don't look at liquids and turn them upside down to see if they're viscous. So it wasn't ever hitting that market. It was just hitting the marijuana user market. And so the government had to get on top of that. Now, the CDC in the United States made a huge mistake, and they used it as a political opportunity to oppose e-cigarettes. And Bloomberg, as I mentioned earlier, is very much behind it, and various other people. So they made political capital, and they sent out a lot of fake news on it, which hit the entire world stage. And since then, they've had to back down because of the scientific evidence, but it's very quietly written on their website. But they caused a furore that was fake news about what they called Yavali, which was these marijuana liquids.
Yes, I brought it up mainly because there are people who say that e-cigarettes are so dangerous because they cause people to die, or they cause people to have
Yeah,
respiratory failure. And I've
yeah,
read all the latest from the respiratory centers in America and other places. And you're right, it seems to be mainly those who use oil-based or viscous-based products with vitamin E and such like that
yeah.
are causing it, and not a
It's
pure
exclusively, actually, Mooney, it was
yeah.
exclusively those marijuana users. What happened in the beginning was that they were testing people, and they were not admitting that they were marijuana users because they were being tested in states where it was illegal to have marijuana, or there were kids going to high school or whatever. And so they didn't admit that they were marijuana users. And that's why the figures showed that not everyone was a marijuana user. But subsequent investigation showed, yeah, everyone was using this. Everyone who had this illness, Ivali, this illness, were the marijuana users.
Okay. Someone asked how much does it cost to go through NRT, and how long does it take?
Yeah,
And
no, great question.
also, is there a plan to be able to fade it off or take off the NRTs? Maybe you
Yeah,
could give a short answer to that.
yeah. So first of all, it is expensive. So you can go on to your chemist and you'll see they give you some vouchers for discounts nowadays because the manufacturers aren't getting a lot of revenue. So you can get discounts. But broadly speaking, it's about the same as buying 20 cigarette, a pack of cigarettes a week. So slightly more than that, roughly, depending on what you use. So some things are more expensive than others. Patches are less expensive, for example, than gums, but you have to use a combination for it to really work. And then this is the question of, can people continue to use nicotine forever? And the answer is yes. It doesn't have a lot of biological effect on humans. Humans who use nicotine titrate it, so they don't take too much. They don't get, because once you start feeling headachy or nauseous, you stop using it, and then it just goes, that headache and the nausea fades away. So everyone who uses nicotine titrates it quite accurately, so that they don't overdose on it. So it's a pretty safe product, and you can use it for the rest of your life. There's no deleterious effects. As I say, that the most talked about deleterious effect is on the child brain, and that really has not been substantiated and doesn't seem to be logical given the numbers of people who've had nicotine in their brains since they were young.
I doubt children are going to use nicotine patches anyway, or nicotine replacement therapies. One last question here, because we are running out of time, maybe one or two last questions. This a question about senior citizens who've been smoking for decades and have this belief that if they quit, their health will actually suffer. They will cough more. They will be physically not as well.
Yes.
What would you say about that? Are there studies that show
Yeah.
how long-term smokers do when they quit?
Yeah. This is a really good question because there's lots of fake news I was reading over the last few months. So the short answer is it's, as with all poisons, potentially harmful substances, as with all poisons, there's a dose response. So if you stop using it, you'll get less sick. It's as simple as that. So whatever age you stop smoking, your body will start to recover. Now, one of the first effects of for a long-term smoker is that when they stop smoking, they'll start to cough more, and that's really good, because what's happening is that the little cilia in the bronchial tubes are growing back and pushing all the gunk up. So your body is actually healing itself. So if you're coughing and you're coughing up all this stuff, that's really, really good. It means your body is healing. And there are lots of studies to show how the body improves over time. So in the first 3 weeks, you'll get this improvement. The month after, you'll get this improvement. And over periods of years, you'll be back to having a similar mortality and morbidity as a general population. And it takes 10 years or so for the final flurries of the body to fix itself. But you'll get very good changes in the body in the first few months. So whatever age you are, you will definitely get healthier if you stop smoking.
Okay. Last two questions, very quickly. Is it appropriate for healthcare professionals to advocate for the use of alternatives compared to cigarette smoking? And
yes, yeah, it depends on your philosophy. I mean, you know, we in the addictions profession, generally speaking, I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but generally speaking, believe in harm reduction, meaning that if there is a product that reduces harm, then the client should be using it if they've tried everything else. And so in this case, if a client has tried patches and has tried gums and so on and so forth, varenicline and bupropion and all the rest of it, and still hasn't had much success, been to therapy, then it's really important that they be given the option to use these cigarettes or heat-not-burn products, in my view. Of course, they're illegal here, they're banned here, and that's a public health error, in my view.
I think that's also, it's difficult for administrators, or not even administrators, but other people or practitioners to be able to make sense of it, because there's so little information at the moment that is published. And I think part of it is the fear that some of the information, if they publish it, would indicate that it will be better for people to use alternatives than the actual cigarettes. Now, just last question. As someone who has mental health issues, and this is very important because in your earlier slides, you showed us that a huge number of people with anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia, we know in Singapore, they said 70 to 80%, but in other countries, I've seen the figures and they say 90% or more of patients with psychosis actually are smokers. And,
just fine. Yeah, I'm just trying to find the slide. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what's the solution for people with mental health issues, and how can we work with them? Is it one of those dual disability things where we have to work with both their mental health issue and their addiction at the same time, or any suggestions?
Yeah, there's lots of research that's been done on whether we should attack each addiction individually, one at a time, starting with the worst one, the one that's causing the most distress, the most harm, and then moving down the scale. And I think the addiction community, the scientific community, have come to the conclusion that actually you've got to attack them all at the same time, because they all affect the same part of the brain, the reward center, the mesocorticolimbic system of the brain. And if you don't try and address the problems that the person faces, perhaps it's stress, perhaps it's past trauma, or whatever it might be, unless you address the reasons that the person is using a cigarette or using alcohol or a drug, unless you address those reasons, you're not going to get much progress. So addressing all the addictions at once, because it's hitting the same reward center, is the best way to go. So that's generally what people have understood from the research.
Okay. I'd just like to close with, your slide 15, Andrew. Slide
Mm-hmm.
15 is why are cigarettes so addictive?
Mm-hmm.
And there you show us one of the big problems that despite everything that the government can throw at it or other people can throw at it, we really have a problem trying to completely knock out cigarette smoking. And to be fair, if this was a new product, if you could do it without all the side effects of cancer causing and other medical illnesses causation, you would actually think of it as a miracle drug or a miracle pill.
Yes.
Psychoactive substances relieving stress and anxiety, low mood relief, which is one of the reasons why the calmness that comes for a lot of psychotic patients or patients with psychosis symptoms increases your motivation and enthusiasm. So overall, uh, I believe that harm reduction is the way to go for nicotine cessation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
would you like to just say anything in concluding? Maybe a
Yeah,
minute.
sure. I mean, I think it's harm reduction in terms of burning tobacco smoke as opposed to nicotine cessation. So I would say that, and there is research now being done on nicotine for mental illness. In other words, prescribing nicotine for mental illness, both for the symptoms and also for the medication side effects. I would urge everyone in the audience to have a look at the evidence because the scientific evidence is extremely solid about these other nicotine replacement technologies. There have been lots of bad science trying to disprove it, particularly bad science where they try and compare people who are using e-cigarettes, but they were or are also smokers. So obviously, the outcomes are going to be confused because the symptoms that they exhibit from e-cigarettes are symptoms actually from the smoking. So there's lots of bad science out there. I'd urge the audience to look at the studies that seem to show that e-cigarettes are bad because the bad science might be in those studies.
Okay. I think we've run out of time. And so thank you really, Andrew. That was well presented, well researched material and stuff. And I'm sure on behalf of all the participants who are writing in at the moment too, we really want to thank you and I hope that you will allow us to make use of the slides as well for people who would like
Yes,
to know
sure.
more.
Sure. And Mooney, you may want to say a word about how people get their points, their continuing education points.
Yes, I think you just write in this blog, or if you've attended the meeting, send in, and the Asia Pacific Certification Board will give you a certificate of attendance that can be used for your professional education points.
Yeah, actually, we will be sending it out to everyone who has come on to the webinar. Yeah, that's automatic. No need to write it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you, Andrew.
You're welcome.